So this video is kind of supposed to be two parts, or supposed to have two purposes. Purpose number one, the main purpose of the video, is to talk about how I actually do my benchmarking going forward. And that is, my benchmarks are going to be a little bit different than what you see on the mainstream. I'm going to show you what I call simulated benchmarks, which is perfect scenario, which is everything turned off, nothing running in just your benchmark or game or whatever. And then what a lot of people run, which is multi-monitors, a few programs like Discord open, having Chrome, having a video playing in the background, and all that stuff. So the only disclaimer I'm going to put up in here is I actually didn't test all the systems evenly. So the i3 has an advantage because the secondary monitor is not 4K. The Ryzen system had had to deal with that, but I beat the same graphics card. I don't have a 4K monitor anymore. That being said, the results really don't make a drastic difference in the resolution of just the desktop, 1 to 2%. But overall, it's more so not to show the Ryzen 3 2200G versus the i3, which is what this video is titled and kind of about, but to kind of introduce you all to the differences of my testing versus everybody else's and the performance differences that you can see. So let's take a look at how I test, some of the things you can make assumptions going forward, and then what these tests actually yielded. So this is how this test went down. Looking at the system setting configuration, the desktop resolution for the actual game is running at 1080p. The secondary display was at 4K for the AMD system and 1600 by 1200 for the Intel system. Yes, this is going to throw the results off a little bit, but unfortunately I don't have everything to do the conclusion of this because other things got in the way for the schedule on YouTube. But just keep that in mind that this isn't a perfect scenario. I keep motion blur off. FXAA, I keep it at that or lower. I don't like high anti-aliasing because it can give you some inconsistent results. And everything in this particular setup was medium or high. Definitely check out the charts to see which game had which settings, and this will change depending on the configuration. And then the programs I had open, and this was for what I call the real test. The simulated test had nothing open except for hardware monitor, was Chrome with livestechtips.com open, a YouTube running Halo 3 soundtrack on 10-hour loop, at PCBudgetSolutions.com and the WoW forums, and I did also have hardware monitor, CPU-Z, GPU-Z, MSI Afterburner, and Discord, but not logged in. So that's the test scenario. Let's take a look at the test bench. So this is the general system. We have both processors and their respective boards. We are running a single 8 gig stick of DDR4. It is rated up to 3000 megahertz. You'll see on the next slide how that broke down. We have a PowerColor RX 570. We have a Corsair CX550M power supply, a Silicon Power 240 gig SSD, a 1 terabyte storage drive that did pretty much nothing, a Cooler Master case that didn't have the best airflow, but I added some extra fans to increase that, and the SSD. Let's take a look at the individual profiles for each individual test. And here we have the profile. So the AMD system just literally booted up and let it do its thing. So I ran at 3.5 gigahertz on auto, stock cooler. Memory did run 2666 megahertz. I didn't touch anything. The BIOS just automatically set it. GPU power to plus 50%, GPU temp 91 degrees C max. None of these tests the GPU exceeds 75 degrees C, so there's no throttling. The Intel system pretty much identical, 3.6 gigahertz, stock cooler. Memory was set at 2400 megahertz. That was the XMP profile. Again, GPU exact same as previous. And then the AMD OC, 3.9 gigahertz. I achieved that by 1.375 volts. And we used the GameX 400 to cool it. Memory at 2933 megahertz via the DOCP, and then same GPU settings. Now, let's go ahead and dive into some benchmarks. So if you see the word simulated, that would infer that everything was disabled, everything turned off, one monitor, the only thing running was the program and hardware monitor. If it says real, that is where we have all the web page open, the YouTube's playing in the background, Discord, etc. So on this particular test, it was kind of interesting. The 2200G at stock actually took a pretty big hit on single thread performance, and this was replicated a couple times when we ran the real test versus the single core. Multi-core, it took a very similar hit versus the rest of the systems. It seemed that the Intel system kind of as a whole handled the multi-core a little bit better, but when the Ryzen system was overclocked, memory and CPU, it seemed to have a very little hit on the single core, but the multi-core still took a hit. Overall, though, kind of impressed with both chips. They both have done very well in this scenario, but we need to talk about real-world gaming, so let's take a look at that. So For Honor, a good old favorite of mine, test results were really close. The only thing I could say here was the Intel system seemed to be least impacted. We're looking at just under 1 FPS when we had the real world versus the simulated, whereas the AMD Ryzen system seemed to have about anywhere from 2, and actually in this case pretty much 3 FPS across the board, which isn't anything excruciatingly bad, but it's 2 to 3% versus about 1%. But do note that on this particular test, they're all within margin of error, but Ryzen did squeak out a slight win, but margin error at best. Ghost Recon's Wildlands has a very, very similar story. The only exception to this rule is all three scenarios perform very similar. The Ryzen system overclock seemed to do a little bit better when it comes to simulated versus real. We're looking at about 1.3 FPS versus a margin of about 3 FPS on pretty much the stock Ryzen versus the Intel system. The Intel setup did actually squeak out a minor win, but it's really minor. Just like the previous one, we're going to chalk this up as margin of error. Here's one that is not margin of error, because all these benchmarks are usually tested 2 or 3 times, and once I'm getting similar results, if I don't get an outlier, then I may only test once or twice. But the Intel system did take the win. It was a decisive win. We're talking about probably around 4 to 5%. And again, it seems to do better real versus simulated than the Ryzen system. There could be a lot of reasons for this. It could be the way the game's designed. Certain aspects of the game utilize the processors differently, but both are giving really good performance. But you are kind of seeing a difference with simulated performance versus real is a little bit of a change. And going forward, depending on how heavy of a user you are, we can actually start seeing some gaps in what they're saying you should get versus what you're really getting. So here I went ahead and averaged together the real world performance, including Cinebench, which has a big, it really kind of helped out the Intel system for the most part, especially in the real world versus the simulated. But where we're at is the Intel system did win. It pretty much won almost all of them except one, so that's why it didn't quite reach 100%. The overclock Ryzen system came about 2% lower, and then the Ryzen system at stock actually came, quite a fair bit, 7%. So if you're not going to overclock, granted the price difference is going to be quite huge, which we're going to talk about in a minute, but we're looking at 7% performance difference, just plug and play and not doing any kind of overclocking. Let's take a look at total system cost. When I do price to performance, I always look at total system cost. Individual parts, I don't think is really fair. It actually weighs in the fairness of AMD. But total system cost is where it's important, because that's where the decision has to be made. So when we're looking at the system that we built here at stock, the AMD system was a hair under $520. Add in a $20 cooler plus tax, we're at $540. And the Intel system was a bit more. So versus the AMD system, it was about $44 more in the CPU, and the board is about $5 more. So with tax, it's coming in right around $50 and some change more. That's important to note, because when you're budgeting each individual part, you have to look at system costs. Let's see how that breaks down in percentages. So unlike the performance testing, there wasn't a clear 100% winner, since no particular setup won 100% of the test. This one there is, because there's only one price. So from a value standpoint, the best value is the stock Ryzen system, and then in reference to how much that system costs, the overclock system is the next best value, and then the Intel system, being the most expensive, gives you the least value. But let's go ahead and pull the numbers together from both price and performance and see what the best option. So this is the slide to me that matters. This is total system cost versus total performance. It's something really interesting I want to point out. So the stock Ryzen system is approximately 4% less than the overclocked variant. So adding a $20 cooler at $520 is like 3.8% more adding to the budget. But when we go back to the performance testing, it gave us about a 5 to 6% performance increase. Very rarely can you spend 4% and get 5 to 6% more performance. Now, the Intel system came in kind of last here just because how much more expensive the platform is. It's about 50 and some change more than a stock Ryzen system, and it's a little bit more than $30 more expensive than the overclocked Ryzen system, while it barely edged out the overclocked Ryzen system by 2%, while costing about 5 to 6% more. So it actually fell last in this particular category. But that is kind of what I'm all about. It's about budgeting. It's about real world performance. And that is why I wanted to bring this video to you today. Let's go ahead and wrap everything up. So as you saw, the i3 sort of won out in some areas. It traded blows pretty evenly with the 2200G, and I mean, we did pair it with the graphics card you'd normally expect, so we did run to a little bit of a GPU bottleneck in some cases, but I did try to keep the settings down, to increase frame rates, to try to give some separation. Again though, I don't want to run stuff on low, because the expectation, should we run these games medium or high settings, or in some cases, like if we did GTA 5, you might even run even higher, like the maximum settings. But I'm going to do real world testing going forward. I always have, but now I'm going to show you exactly how I'm going to do it, and I'm going to try to standardize it. There will be some changes with the secondary monitor, most likely, because I ran it at 1600 by 1200, but I am going to get another 1080p monitor or 1440p. 1440p would actually be ideal, but for now I will go over the testing methodology at the beginning of each video until we actually get something standardized, of which I'll do kind of like what Gamers Nexus does, which is send you guys a link to a page on my website to go over my testing methodology. So hopefully this kind of gave you the too long didn't read. The 2200G is a better value. If you're going to overclock, you're going to be able to stretch its legs pretty far. The money you would save from going from an i3 to 2200G, especially if you get on sale, you can get yourself like a deep cool GameX 400, which is often on sale for $20 or less. You're still going to save $20 or $30 and get very close to, if not very similar performance. So if you like this video, hit that like button. If you didn't, hit that dislike button. I understand. Leave a comment in the section below. We'll talk a little bit about this. Get subscribed, helps me out a lot. You want to buy anything that I use in this video, links will be in the description. Stay tuned, there's more coming down the channel here shortly. But as always, this is Steve from PC Budget Solutions, and I'll see you all later on down the road.